Empathetic listening. So this one, you can follow a little bit of a formula to start out with because it is a more involved skill. So I'll get into the formula right after I explain the skill. Essentially, empathetic listening means the goal of every conversation is to first figure out exactly what your spouse believes, what your spouse thinks, and what your spouse is feeling before trying to be understood. So seeking first to understand as opposed to being understood. And it doesn't mean you'll never be understood. You will get the opportunity to explain where you're coming from, but only second to your spouse. So the way you can practice this in a conversation, this works really well, especially when you guys are having a disagreement about something. So you'll sit down with your spouse. I recommend trying to make some sort of physical contact. So either holding hands or, putting your hand on your spouse's leg or something like that, because physical contact can really help us be more collaborative, be more kind during the conflict. Essentially, it helps us stay on the same team as opposed to reverting to being on opposing teams, fighting each other. So you sit down together, some sort of physical contact, and your spouse starts, explains her position or his position, and then you ask enough follow-up questions until you think you really understand what she's saying. And then you summarize back to her. Okay, honey, I get it. You're frustrated with me about the fact that I was late to pick up our kid from school today. That put you in an awkward position with the teacher, and I'm really sorry about that. Is that actually how you're feeling? Is that actually how you see it? And this is really important. You don't want to just assume that you understand. This is what we often do, is we assume because we're hearing the words coming out of our spouse's mouth that we get it, that we know where they're coming from. But you actually have to ask, am I getting this right? Is this actually where you're coming from? And as soon as your spouse says, yes, it is, then you move on, and then it's your turn to explain where you're coming from. But if your spouse says, no, that's not exactly what I mean, or that's not really what I said, then you keep asking questions, keep asking for clarification until you have really nailed down exactly what your spouse has said and you're able to verbalize that back to them. And the reason this is so effective is it's very similar to the physical touch during a disagreement. Obviously, only physical touch out of love and affection. This empathetic listening does wonders to disarm each other. So you shift away from a mindset of fighting each other or being squared off like you're in a boxing match. In a boxing match, the two fighters are facing each other. It allows one of you to cross to the other side of the ring and stand right next to your spouse so that you two are shoulder to shoulder. So you're fighting the issue together. That only works, though. You can only cross over to your spouse's side, extend that olive branch, become your spouse's teammate instead of opponent if you truly understand where he's coming from. That's going to shift the conversation away from a fight into a collaboration to solve whatever the issue is. To be honest with you, this is one of my all-time favorite techniques. I love it. I've used it with most of my couples, and for every single couple that was able to follow the steps of listening and then summarizing back and then asking more questions until they really understood and could verbalize back to their spouse, that process in itself is healing. So this is one of the techniques I would recommend starting with if it seems like something that could help your marriage.